Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us for this first European law interview. This first series is devoted to the internal market and environmental measures. The program is sponsored by the Monnet Chair, which is part of the European Commission Education and Training Program. We have the great opportunity today to interview Professor Nicolas de Sadeleer. He is a professor in European and environmental law at Université Catholique de Louvain and Université Saint-Louis, Brussels. Good morning, Professor.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you very much for joining us. Our first interview today will be devoted to the basics, basically, of the internal market and environmental measures. So it started in the 70s with a big raise of the importance of the environment. So people were very concerned about greenhouse gases emissions or brownfields, landfills problems, pollution. And at the time we had what we called the end of the pipe policy. What do you think of it? Do you think that this was really the end of the pipe policy?
Well, thanks to EU environmental policy and law, much has been achieved over these last 30 years regarding substantial reduction of contamination of air and aquatic environment, regarding the elimination of ozone depleting substances, regarding the elimination of industrial hazards, regarding nature protection. And that means that so far environmental law and policy worked. That being said, in spite of all these progresses, the results of environmental policy in Europe remain muted. Waste quantities are on the increase, acidification still ruining aquatic environment, the impact of climate change on ecosystems, in particular in the south of Europe, become very visible with the multiplication of fires, drought, water shortages, and there is indeed a tremendous loss of biodiversity, in particular in the course of these last years. In addition to this, Europeans are facing multiple new sources of time-delayed threats, in particular in the field of chemicals. In addition to this, look at air pollution. The European population is losing nearly 500,000 inhabitants a year for fine particles.
Okay, thank you. So you just mentioned new environmental threats. Can you please tell us and explain which factors contributed to their rise?
An end-of-the-pipe approach was much needed on the account that Europeans faced very obvious contamination of the environment. Needless to say that Europe has been facing, in the course of these last 20 years, drastic structural economic changes. In particular, there has been a shift from very material and energy intensive industrial sectors to a services economy. And with post-industrialization, the growth in emission has been much more consumption related. So consumption is growing much faster than the European population. And as a result, EU accounts for a huge percentage of the consumptions in raw materials, in natural resources, in energy on the planet. Accordingly, the footprint of the European Union is quite tremendous.
So basically we consume more and more goods and services, and do you think that this fact has an impact on the environment?
Yes, of course. The consumption of products and services does have both direct and indirect impact at all stages, from the extractions of raw materials to the manufacturing process using much energy and raw materials, the processing part, the transport of the goods, the consumption of the goods and the services, and the waste management part, the disposal of the end-used product or that had become a waste. In addition to this, the amount of raw materials and energy being used, or the number of pollutants being discharged into the environment, or the quantity of waste being disposed of, does vary significantly according to the technologies being used, to the industrial processes, to the take-back obligation, or to the waste management process. So it's extremely difficult at the outset to determine for each specific product or each specific service the amount of energy, raw materials likely to be used, or the environmental impact as a matter of emission of pollutants or waste being discarded.
So nowadays, sustainable development is a top priority issue. It's even written in EU treaties, for example, in Article 3.3 TEU or Article 11 TFEU. If you don't mind, I'm going to read Article 3 as a short reminder for students watching.
Please do.
Okay, so Article 3 basically reads that the Union shall work for the sustainable development of Europe based on balanced economical growth and price stability, a highly competitive social markets economy aiming at full employment, social progress, and high level of protection and improvement of the quality of the environment. So the Union shall promote scientific and legal advance. Okay, so my question here is, does sustainable development oblige public authorities to endorse a new product policy?
Yes, in my view, the answer is straightforward. One must be noted at the outset that the initial task of environment policy was to curb a tremendous level of contamination, in particular water contamination, and that led during the 31st years of that policy to this end-of-the-pipe approach. However, such an approach has been sidelining the issue of the conservation of natural resources. Though natural resources are obviously necessary for economic growth, they are nonetheless limited. And sustainable development is coming into the picture on the account that it's raising serious questions regarding the limits, the physical limits of our production and consumption processes. So what's the point in requiring new technologies for cars if cars sales are on the increase? What's the point to implement greenhouse gas quotas for aviation if air travel is on the increase? Why on earth are municipalities designating nature sanctuaries around cities if they are unable, through their land planning policies, to curb urban sprawl? So sustainable development, in a nutshell, is an attempt to reconcile the economic needs of growth with the sheer limits of the natural resources that we do exploit.
So we go back to the main problem. So the EU is based on economical integration, and we might have a clash between environmental measures and the necessity to have free trade and free movement of goods. So what are your views on the matter? Can we avoid the clash?
Well, at the heart of the economic integration process that's underpinning the European Union lies the internal market. So the internal market is not only an economic dream, it's a legal figure enshrined in the treaties. And internal market is reckoning upon, on the one hand, the absence of competition, of unfair competition between European undertakings, and on the other, on free circulation of goods, services, capitals, and workers. And accordingly, the internal market is about the free flow of goods, of values, of capitals, and as a result, it's leading to the deregulation of any state measures that's likely to hinder that free circulation. So indeed, there is constantly a clash between the aspiration of the free trade area underpinning the internal market and the national aspiration to increase the level of protection of their consumers, their health, or the environment, so to speak.
Okay, thank you very much. You just talked about states, so my next question is, which authorities lay down product standards? States, for example?
Well, the picture is much more complex than that one. At the outset, one should realize that national environmental law won't exist without a flurry of international environmental agreements. Among the 1,000 environmental agreements, but a few deal with product standards, among which the Basel Agreement on waste, well, covering transfrontier movement of waste. But it's possible to note other agreements such as the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances, or the Rotterdam Convention on the informed consent for the export of hazardous pesticides or chemicals, and last but not least, the Stockholm Convention on the persistent organic pollutants. That being said, member states are vested in accordance with the principle of subsidiarity, with room for maneuver in regulating hazardous products whenever the field or the category of products has not been regulated by the EU institutions through legal acts. So member states are able to determine their level of protection in banning products, in regulating the use of products, or in placing restrictions upon the marketing of some products whenever there is no complete harmonization at EU level. Last but not least, in connection with the internal market, the EU institutions have been keen for these last 30 years to lay down a number of product requirements through directives, regulations, and decisions. And in most of the cases, whenever these legal acts are based upon Article 114, they are leading to a maximum harmonization, and as a result, they do deprive the member states to enact, as freely as they wish, their own environmental standards. So in other words, whenever the field has been preempted by the EU institutions, the room for maneuver left to the member states is diminishing quite significantly.
So you just introduced 3 levels. So first of all, international agreements, then national measures, and finally EU secondary law. Do you mind giving concrete examples, for example, of directives for the third category?
Well, actually, the emphasis has been placed by the European Commission and the lawmaker on regulation. So a number of areas, categories of products are regulated, are governed by specific regulations, in some cases directives, and they do encompass categories such as GMOs, pesticides, fertilizers, detergents, seeds, foodstuffs, fuels, cars, trucks, airplanes, chemicals, as a matter of fact, biocides, and so on. So one is really amazed by the huge array of categories of substances and products that are governed nowadays by regulations or directives based upon Article 114 of the treaty.
So it's quite difficult to know whether or not harmonization is complete. Can you please explain how we can assess this element? Are there loopholes? How does it work, basically?
Well, actually there is no benchmark against which it's possible to assess whether the harmonization is deemed to be maximum or complete or minimal. So it's a rather grey area. So in different judgments, the Court of Justice is taking the view that the level of harmonization is deemed to be complete. In other judgments, the court is taking the view that the level of harmonization is deemed to be maximal. It's, however, somewhat difficult to draw the distinction or the dividing line between what's minimal and what's maximal. As a result, the member states do face difficulties in determining the room for maneuver in enacting their proper complementary regulations. So the question arises always as to whether the area has been completely preempted by the EU lawmaker. Perhaps this is one of the most difficult questions today in connection with the functioning of the internal market.
Let's go back to the very topic of today's interview. Can you please tell me how national environmental product measures can hinder trade, basically?
On the one hand, the environmental policy carried out by the member states is likely to impinge directly on the marketing of foreign products whenever the national authorities are adopting authorizations or registration procedures, whenever they require substitution of hazardous chemicals by less dangerous chemicals, or whenever the product's requirements relate to the dimension, to the weight, to the labeling of the products at issue. That being said, member states can also affect indirectly the marketing of foreign products in requiring a specific selling arrangement, in providing for distribution or collection arrangement, in placing upon traders take-back obligations of discarded products, in regulating advertisement, labeling, or the information to be provided to the consumers, or in adopting economic instruments such as taxes, fees, charges, or even emission trading schemes. So all in all, member states' product policy is likely to jeopardize directly or indirectly the placing upon the market of foreign products within a member state.
So everything is linked with the principle of free movement of goods. It's supposed to be a fundamental principle of the treaty in EU law. And can you please explain then if there is a single approach to enhance this free movement of goods?
Well, at the outset, at the apex of the hierarchy of norm stand the treaty provisions. And so one speaks of negative harmonization whenever the treaty provisions are not fleshed out into specific directives and regulations. The economic rights enshrined in treaty law do apply directly. For instance, with respect to the freedom of goods, Articles 28, 30, 34, 35, 36, and 110 are likely to enhance the economic rights vested to the importers and exporters of goods within the EU. Regarding services, the provisions of services is likely to be enhanced thanks to Article 56. So all these provisions do have direct effect. Accordingly, traders are likely to invoke them directly before their national jurisdictions against their state authorities. It must be noted also that these provisions are mutually exclusive. They do not overlap. Each provision has its own field, its own set of derogations. Its scope of ambit must be determined according extremely specific criteria. But such an approach is insufficient, given that it's really leading to a case-by-case analysis of each situation. So in order to complement negative harmonization, the EU institutions are vested with regulatory powers in order to adopt directives, regulations, and decisions that are laying down or carving out a common playing field for traders in regulating at EU level all the requirements with which the traders have to apply. You know, so that's a complementary approach. That's an added value to the negative harmonization on the account that the EU institutions are, with respect to GMOs, to pesticides, to seeds, to vehicles, to aircrafts, to watercrafts, determining the conditions according to which these goods can be placed on the market or can be used.
Okay, thank you very much for explaining this very important difference between positive and negative harmonization. I would like to go back to positive harmonization. Can you please tell us which products are covered by positive harmonization?
Well, as already stressed, one is really amazed by the huge variety of products that so far has been covered. In particular, thanks to the Commission Jacques Delors, there has been an endeavor to standardize, to harmonize national practices, national legislation, national regulations through huge sets of directives and regulations.
And in your opinion, what is the best option for traders?
The advantage entailed by positive harmonization for a trader is that they will have to apply one set of rules. Whenever they comply with the standards laid down either by the directive or the regulations, they are enabled to place their products on the market. In case of negative harmonizations, the traders have to assess whether the national measures restricting the marketing of their products is consistent with the various treaty provisions. So my view is that the positive harmonization process is much more favorable than a case-by-case, changeable, adjudicatory process.
Thank you very much. This is the end of our first interview on the internal market and environmental measures. So basically today we discussed a big introduction to the internal market. We started with this end-of-the-pipe policy, and we saw that there are new environmental issues and big problems, for example, climate change. Then we discussed the fact that in our society we consume more and more goods and services. After that, we discussed the fact that the principle of sustainable development is now embedded and enshrined in treaty provisions. After that, we saw that we can have three types of measures. So international measures, then national measures, and finally EU secondary measures. After that, we discussed directly measures affecting directly trade and measures affecting indirectly trade. And finally, we discussed a bit the principle of free movement of goods and the very important difference between positive and negative harmonization. And don't forget that for traders, the best option is positive harmonization. We'll see you next time for another interview focusing on Article 34 and Article 35 of the TFEU. Thank you very much, and see you next week. Bye.